This video is sponsored by Chomps.
Moldings. We are on to the phase to trim out the entire house, and I'm so excited to go from a house that looks like a construction site to a house that looks like something that's livable. And the key to that is covering up all those gaps in the floor and around the windows with some nice moldings. Now, this can be intimidating because you can easily make or break a house with moldings alone. You can make it look like a cheap apartment, a McMansion, or you can tie all the architecture together, and that's what I'm hoping to do. It's also one of the last phases in any remodel, which means that you're exhausted, you're running out of time, you might have a baby arriving in like 2 months, and in my case, the painters are showing up in a week. So I have a limited amount of time to get this done, but I have gotten all the millwork from a local lumberyard to match the original architecture of the house, which I think is a solid move. But I'm gonna go into a lot of details of how to make the molding look right, how to make it look like it would have if it was installed in the 1940s. We're just gonna get the job done right, and hopefully by the end of this video, we'll see it fully painted, looking crisp and clean. So let's get into the house, start setting up a workspace, and get to work.
One thing that I've learned over the years is that the most critical thing about setting up for doing moldings in a house is your workspace and making sure that the workspace is very central in the house so you can access all the rooms you're gonna trim out. Extension rails are also super important. Some of these moldings are 16 feet long, so I need to make sure I have plenty of support on both sides and room to cut them. This house was built in 1940, and I searched for moldings that would match the vintage moldings that I already have existing in the house. I've always thought that they're very nice, they're very proportionate to the 8-foot tall ceilings, and I was lucky enough to find ones that match pretty darn well. I decided to start the project with the door casings because the baseboards have to butt up against these pieces of trim, so I can't get good measurements on that until these are in place. I used the old paint lines to measure the reveal, which was 1/4 inch, and that's pretty standard to set your trim back 1/4 inch from the edge of the jamb. There are 3 pieces that make up a door casing. There's the top bit and then the 2 sides, and I like to glue them together to make sure that they don't separate, especially on doors because they're moving parts. So I nailed it off on the floor. Sometimes I'll do it on the wall, but I had limited access, so the floor made the most sense. Then I can move it into place and fit it to the door. This trim fit up real nice, and it is handy to have those paint lines to go off of. If I didn't have that, I would probably draw out all the lines, and we'll get to that when I start working on windows, but for now, there's still more doors to do. So there's really not a ton of doors that need this because I left a lot of the vintage moldings up, but all the areas where I removed the lath and plaster and replaced it with drywall, that all needs to be retrimmed, which means that the pocket door also needs to be trimmed out, but it's got its own set of issues. So this door frame is for the pocket door, and when they installed the drywall, they screwed it in right here. You can see they tore out some of the grain. So I'm gonna repair that, but I also need to widen this because I made a miscalculation. Both sides are about 1/4 inch shy, so I need to add a little bit more poplar onto the side here and bring it up to this level. So I'm gonna start on that. This sort of thing happens on job sites all the time, so it's really handy to know how to repair it. All this stuff is going to get painted, so I'm gonna add in what's called a Dutchman. You can do this with a palm router, but I love any excuse to use hand tools. I could use the practice, and it's just a lot more fun. All you have to do is score it and use a sharp chisel to clear out the excess. Then you make a plug that's slightly oversized to the hole and glue that into place. Once the glue dries, you trim off the excess with hand plane and you're good to go. With that patch finished up, I can now bring out the door jamb to the appropriate size to make it flush with the drywall. So that one jamb was installed when the pocket door hardware was installed, but the rest of the jamb gets built out using these orange tabs into a kerf cut that slides into the aluminum rails in the extrusion. This is a kit that comes from Cavity Slider, and they have designed this really cool system where they lock into place and then you can pull them away to service the door. It's super clever, but I can't nail the door casing into these because then that kind of defeats the purpose. So I install them temporarily. I'll pull them back out when the painters come and they'll just paint them separately. But I need them installed so I know the correct reveal for the door casing. Again, that's going to be a 1/4 inch. And I just built this one on the wall, unlike the other ones that I built on the floor. But it's basically built the same way with nailed off corners. The corners are glued. And I just made sure that I wasn't nailing into that wood so I can remove it later. And with that, all of the doors throughout the house are trimmed out, and so I can start working on the baseboards. Now you can see why I needed those casings in there, because the baseboards slide right up against the casing, and I need to have accurate measurements to put them into place. The first couple of pieces of baseboard I'm going to install are going to be super simple. They'll just be 90-degree cuts at each end, butted up against the walls. And the reason for this, and the reason why I'm not doing inside miters on these inside corners, is because I'm going to cope all of those cuts. And that's going to take a little explaining to understand why.
So cope joints are used by carpenters for interior miters. So imagine if you were to put a miter together like this, that's fine as long as it is perfectly 90 degrees. But as we know, most walls are not perfectly 90 degrees. So if it goes askew at all, you're gonna end up with pretty large gaps in both directions. And that means a lot of caulk, and it's not gonna look very good. So what carpenters do instead is they make something called a cope cut, where they cut basically a profile into the molding, and that allows it to sit tighter even if it's slightly out of square. Now, how do you make this cut?
Ironically, you start by cutting an inside miter to make a cope cut. What this does is it reveals the profile that needs to be cut away with the coping saw. Now, admittedly, this is a very simple profile, and we're going to get more complex when we get to the windows, but the principles are exactly the same. Since this is such a simple profile, I'm going to help myself out and cut a majority of the flat section out using the miter saw, and that's a good place to start before going to the coping saw. Admittedly, I'm pretty rusty with a coping saw. It takes a bit of time to get used to it, and this is my first cut of this project. So don't judge me too hard if you're an expert at this, but I do get better as I go, and you will too if you try this out. So the main thing is to follow the line that you see from that miter cut and to back bevel it slightly, because that's gonna allow more flexibility when you go to slide it into the mating piece. And that's really the hard bit. All the outside miters get cut in a normal 45-degree mitered way. Sometimes you may want to adjust that if the walls are really askew, but I find for the most part you can kind of force them into square. Another trick that I like to do is I like to leave some of these outside miters a little long. It's easier to trim back an outside miter than it is to do a cope cut. So a lot of times I'll just leave them unnailed until I get the other piece in and sneak up on the fit so I can get it really, really good. Something I've learned the hard way from doing other baseboards in other houses is that you want to cut the longest pieces first, because you can actually cut yourself into a situation where you run out of long boards. If you start from one corner of the house and wrap all the way around it, you may be making a lot more small cuts and cutting into long boards that you need later. So it looks like I'm doing this really piecemeal. You'll find like I'm doing some in this room, some in that room, but it is important to do it this way because you need those 16 or 12-foot sections to run the full length of these walls. Otherwise, you end up doing scarf joints, and those never quite look right. Now, once you've cut those boards once, you can use all of those scrap pieces to stitch in other places. So I'm doing that as well. As I have an off-cut end, I'll find a place that fits, and then I'll cut a board for it. And then as you can see in this breakfast nook corner, I'm again trimming the outside miter to fit so I don't have to trim up the inside miter, the coped edge, to get the fit just right.
That's perfect.
Once I have the fit that I want, I go back through and I nail it off, and I use a stud finder to detect the studs in the wall, so I make sure I have a good firm connection with these 16 gauge nails. There are some situations where the longest wall is not the most ideal, and that happened in this bedroom where there's this one wall that it's one of the shortest walls in the room, but if I put that in last, I will have to make 2 cope cuts, and I try my best to avoid that situation. So what I did was I cut for that wall first, and then I installed the 2 side walls that made up to it, which allowed me to only make 1 cope cut per board, saving time and also just making it a lot easier. In older houses like this, it's not uncommon to have big dips or humps in the floor, and that was the case for this side of the wall, and I had to shim it up, I had to scribe it, so I shimmed up both ends, making sure it was level, and then I set my scribe to the biggest gap I could find, and then I run the pencil side along the areas between those gaps, and that gives me a perfect line to follow when I go to trim it out with a jigsaw.
So I'm curious, do you all keep snacks in your shop? If you do, have you tried Chomps? That's right, they're back and they've kindly sponsored this video. And I've started keeping Chomps in my shop because they just keep me going throughout the day. I'm too busy to take lunch breaks and I'd rather snack. So each Chomp stick has 10 to 12 grams of protein, no sugar, grass-fed beef, and they are seriously tasty. They come in a variety of flavors, including original beef, jalapeno, sea salt, and original turkey. They are great for on the go. I take them on hikes, flights, road trips, you name it, I'm packing Chomps. So last time Chomps sponsored a video, they asked whether you were team jalapeno or team original. The originals took it, but I'm sticking with my team jalapeno because these things are delicious. This go around, let me know in the comments if you've tried Chomps as a shop snack and where you keep your secret snack stash. I promise I won't tell anybody. Visit the link in my description to learn more, and thanks Chomps for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the house. All right, so all the rest of the baseboards are in the house except for the bay window, and I've put this off till the end because it's the most confusing one. and it took me a little bit to puzzle it out. But here's what I figured out. So this is a 45-degree angle, which makes sense. If you were to turn this into just a regular corner, 90 degrees, and then you cut it perfectly in half, the angles would be half, and then that leads to 45 degrees. So I've established that these are 45 degrees, but what angles I cut for each section is a little more complicated. So for this inside corner, all I do is cut a 45-degree angle. That kind of makes sense because it's meeting a 45-degree angle. And then for the coped cut, I can do the same because it's meeting that angle again. But I found out it's a little more complicated when it gets to the outside corner. I need to cut a 22.5-degree angle, which makes sense because for a 90-degree corner, you would cut 45-degree angle to form miter, which is half the size. So you divide that in half again, and you get 22.5 degrees. So now that I've done all my test cuts, I feel pretty confident that I can make all the regular cuts, so let's get to it.
The first piece that I'm cutting is the one that goes against the back wall, and that's got those 2 reverse miter cuts. Now I did shim out the bottom edge because the skim coating on the wall sort of bumped it forward, and if this goes out of square, it's gonna mess up the cope cuts. The right-hand corner needed a little bit more shimming, so I used my square and a bit of handy shim behind that corner to bring it out, and even then I could nail it off. The next step is to start in on those cope cuts. And I started by making a 22.5-degree cut, and that's what's going to indicate where to cut my cope. I then tilted the saw to 45 degrees and flipped the workpiece around, and this is gonna allow me to cut out that back beveled section, just getting the bulk of the material away before going to the coping saw. Use the coping saw. It's a little more complicated to cut on this angle just because it's a lot more extreme, and I'm not very good with using this saw. So I cut out what I could with the saw, and then I went back with a rasp and cleaned it up. The flat wall matches to the slanted wall with a 22.5-degree angle, and once those fit well, I can nail them off. The opposing wall gets the same treatment, and as you can see, once it's nice and square, those copes fit really nicely. It's definitely worthwhile to shim out that bottom section because everything fits well and it looks nice and crisp. Now that the baseboards are done, it's time to turn my attention to the windows, and these are a little bit more complicated. My design is going to be replicating the original moldings in the house. You can see there is a frame around the top as well as an apron down below and this 1-inch thick stool, which is a really nice feature. When they replaced some of the moldings in the 90s, you can see they used 3/4 of an inch, and that does not look nearly as good. In the future, I might retrim the bay window, but for now, it's the only one left, and these vintage moldings look so much better, so that's what I'm basing the rest of them off of. We had a bunch of the windows replaced in the house, and one of them was this kitchen window that was in real rough shape. The window framers added in this stop, and that's what I'm gonna base all of my measurements off of because it sticks out by 1/4 inch, and that's what I'm gonna rest all of the framing against. The first piece to make is that stool, and to get the right sizing, I traced out on a scrap piece of framing material how far out it would go on each side, and then I add 3/4 of an inch to each side, and that's my final width. I cut out a chunk of poplar to the correct size, and then I brought it back to my workshop to rabbet out the back edge. This is what's gonna go on the window sill, and I need to rabbet out a little bit of a section so it sits at the right height. In order to get it to slot in between the sides of the framing of the window, I also need to cut out some corners, and since I was already in the shop, I cut those out on the bandsaw. Okay, so that matches the other moldings, but it's just really deep. I feel like, just especially for here, when I'm gonna have a faucet, I don't know how far back the faucet's gonna be, but this may conflict. I might just do a real minimal, just a little bit past the actual molding. I think that might be better for this specific situation. So I'm gonna write this down. I feel like a lot of times I have to see these things in person rather than in drawings to make sure that they look right. And I think this was the right move to make it a little bit shallower. I think it's going to work a little better. So feeling confident that I liked it, I nailed it off and could move on to the rest of the framing. With the stool in place, framing out a window is basically the same as doing the casings for a door. Those stops that were in there made it really easy to rest the side sections right up against them. And then I did the same thing where I glued the miters together, nailed them in from the top and the sides. I'm leaving off the apron because I'm waiting until we do tile, but I'll show that on the next set of windows that I'm working on. Speaking of which, I decided to mill out all the material that I need for the remaining stools for the rest of the windows all at once, so I didn't have to keep coming back and forth to my shop. So now I'm moving on to one of the more complicated windows, which is this breakfast nook window. And getting these miters to line up is a bit of a challenge. What I like to do is cut a little bit of scrap and install that on either side to check the miters first. The right side, the miter was fine, but the left side, the miter was off by about a degree. So I just shifted my capex over by 1 degree, recut it, and double checked to make sure that fit really tightly. I can also use those scrap pieces to help me measure to where the miter ends up. And I made marks on the wall again to show where that stool is going to end up. Now that I had accurate measurements, I can start cutting the material to length, and it turned out that both sides were exactly the same size. The only difference was that 1 degree shift. Since I'm not in my shop anymore, I'm not going to use the bandsaw to cut out these edges. I decided to try out something I hadn't before on the Capex, which is their depth stop. Now, not every miter saw has this, but it's pretty handy if they do, because you can just nibble away material and get the right size that you want. It also helps because some of the drywall sets a little back from the framing, so I can relieve another notch right around the framing, and so I get a really nice fit to the drywall. Before installing them permanently, I give everything a quick sand, and then I also had to shim up the back sill because it was sitting a little bit lower than the side ones. Once I put in a little bit of extra poplar, it was a nice tight fit. I could nail everything off and fit in those side stools. Because these windows are in an alcove, it is going to make it a little more complicated to do the trim around it, but it's very similar to what I did for the baseboards in that I'm gonna have to cope those corners. So the captured corners, the two on the back wall, I'm gonna install first, and then I'll cope everything to fit. So I installed the apron as well as the top bit of framing, nailed those off, and then I can start coping some corners. This molding is a lot more complicated than the baseboards, and what I ended up finding was I actually started scribing these corners in because my 45-degree cut wasn't quite working. I also found that cutting some relief notches and sort of ignoring certain sections as you're cutting helped, and the thing that was invaluable was that rasp. I found that if I took my time, I was able to get it pretty accurate, maybe not perfect, but good enough. Since this is an old house and the old walls were plaster, there were some gaps in the moldings. So I found that just adding a tapered piece of poplar on the back side of this molding was enough to fill the gap, at least enough to finish it off with caulking later. It's like the Jimmy DiResta saying of you go to school on the first one. I started moving pretty quick through these windows after I had a couple of them under my belt. The miters were fitting great. I was figuring out how to shim these things up better, and I was finding really good solutions to working around these older windows. I decided to finish off all of the framing first, and then I turned my attention to the aprons, which have their own set of challenges. To measure out for an apron, you want it to end up at the exact same spot of the window frame above the stool. So I had a mark that ran all the way down, and then I can cut a miter cut at the very end because I want to do a little return around the corner. To finish off the return, I cut a little tiny piece at a 90-degree angle that's already cut at a 45, and then I can glue that on to the end. I find that if I nail these on, I always split this little piece out, so I'm just using some Total Boat CA glue to hold it in, and this is plenty. Once it's caulked and painted, that thing is going nowhere. With the fit looking good, I nailed that in, and then I can turn my attention to the opposing piece. All right, at this point I feel like I've done this so many times, I'm getting a lot better at it. The technique has changed quite a bit, so check it out. I think my biggest discovery was cutting a lot of relief notches. If you cut relief notches at the apex of any of the curves, it just makes it a lot easier because these parts fall away, giving you more room for your saw blade, which makes a lot of sense. It's very similar to the technique of cutting relief notches when you're using a bandsaw, and this functions very similar to a bandsaw. Now, I'll admit, I set this camera up and I was like, oh, this one's gonna be great because I'm doing so good. This was a little of a rough one, but you can see how much I can refine it by scribing again and using that rasp to get a perfect fit. And that's the last little bit of detailing that I need to do on the windows. I think the aprons look great. I'm really happy with how they look, but they are still raw wood, and I want to show you guys this fully painted. The painters are showing up in the next day, so I've got a little bit of prep work to do before everything's ready for them. A big part of that is just filling in all these nail holes. There are tons of nail holes throughout the house, and I'm just using spackle to fill them in, but I'm taking my time. I'm not building up really heavy amounts of spackle. One thing that surprised me and also made less work for me was that I asked what the painters wanted me to do, and they actually didn't want me to fill in any nail holes on unprimed surfaces. They said that it won't adhere nearly as well. So that's great, and probably a good tip for people to prime before they fill or caulk. I'm using this other product that's called Glazing and Spot Putty. This I'm using to fill in all the old dents and dings, hopefully to bring the old moldings up to the level of the new moldings so things match a little better. You know, it's an old house. These moldings have been here for a long time, so they have a lot of dents and dings, and this dries relatively fast, and it's very sandable and also very strong. So I got through some of that, but I had to wait until the next morning to finish everything off.
Okay, so today is Monday, and that means the painters are showing up. They're gonna be here in 2 hours. I was up pretty late last night trying to get everything done, but I didn't get everything done. I still got a couple things to sand and stuff. So I'm gonna work on that, pull all my tools out of here, and I cannot wait to see what this stuff looks like with a fresh coat of paint on it.
Hello.
Oh, howdy.
Hello.
How's it going?
A little early. Are you ready for us?
Kind of.
Okay.
As you can tell, I wasn't quite ready for them, but they were here, so I packed up the rest of my tools and let them in to do their thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's plenty of room. Thank you.
It was a late decision to hire professional painters for this project, but I think it was the right one because it is the surface layer, and when you watch both Richard and Grayson work, you can tell that they're experts, that they know what they're doing, and that they're going to do a lot better job than I will.
So you use the oil-based stuff?
Yeah.
Just so that it doesn't, like, swell?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't swell. It actually dries quicker. It just reacts to the latex paint better. And then it was one of my contractor friends who told me to switch to this shellac primer.
Yeah.
And this shellac primer is really liquidy, but it just goes on and it levels out so nice. So it takes a little technique, but then once you get it, it just works so well.
Oh, wow, it's really runny.
Yeah, it's really runny. I see. It was because it was so full.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, it's almost like water.
Oh, wow.
It didn't make any sense to me, but it's true. Once I started using it, I can't go back.
Yeah.
It just levels out so well.
I mean, it's good to know also, like, I do a lot of cabinetry. So, like, if I need to paint a cabinet, I imagine that's probably pretty darn good for that as well.
If I were painting these cabinets, I would absolutely use this first, and I would use like a short 1/4-inch weenie roller, and use that in a tray and just do a nice rolled finish, and it just levels out so nice, and you get a nice smooth finish. So then when you put the, like the Benjamin Moore Advance,
Yeah.
that's a little like oil base, it'll also level out, and it just gives a great finish, even rolled out. And
Oh,
fresh.
that's a good tip.
Yeah, so.
Oh, sweet. I'm going to have to try that.
I know a lot of you guys have been following this build from the early days when we tore out these walls and are right there with me when you're looking at this stuff being like, wow, it looks so good. It's amazing to see all this stuff get cleaned up and repainted and looking fresh and new, and I just love it. Now, one thing that wasn't quite right, but is kind of inevitable when you choose some bright colors for your house is that you're going to get some of them wrong. And Richard was really patient with me and Ashley when we honed in on the right color.
So when I looked at the photo, we're looking at the light areas and the dark areas. So light areas, dark areas.
Yeah.
So if this is too light, we can try this one.
Yeah.
So even if Ashley wants to look at it this evening to see it with the low light, that's fine.
Okay.
If we need to do it tomorrow, we can do it tomorrow. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be good. I mean, I think it looks a lot better.
Yeah, I think we're on the right track.
Going from this.
Yeah, totally.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah. So I think we're on the right track now, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of those is gonna work.
Yeah.
Here.
I don't think that's ever been painted.
Yeah, I don't think it has either. It looks so much better painted.
No.
The guys did such an amazing job, and I love watching professional painters cut in. They also fully covered up that wild green. I think we could have lived with it, but we also have a pretty wild red going into the mudroom, and I think that might be the brightest color that we need in the house.
Beautiful.
Wow. Excellent.
Looks great.
Looks cool.
Nice
Love
job,
it.
guys.
Oh, it's so satisfying to do that.
Okay, so the house is fully painted and it looks awesome, and I'm gonna take you in there in a second to give you the full tour. But first I wanna talk about the pre-sale that I launched at the beginning of the month. I'm going to extend it for an extra week because this video is out a week late, and I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to get orders in. The designs are based on the flooring that we found in the house when we did demo, and I've redesigned it. I've made stickers, hats, t-shirts, and patches. They look amazing. You guys have been awesome. Those of you who have purchased it, thank you so much. Go check out almfab.com and you can find all of them on there. This is a pre-sale, limited edition. I'm only gonna print as many as you guys order and they will be to you by Christmas. So thanks so much. Thank you to Chomps for sponsoring this video, and thank you as always to my Patreon supporters. You guys are the best. Now let's get into that house for some beauty shots.